Hello, very beautiful community. Thank you for your patience. We had a small delay, but now it's great to be together with you to discuss Donald Trump's war with Iran and the killing of the Ayatollah and what this means for the state of international relations. Now, immediately, I need a tiny favor from you as we talk on, and that is I want you to let me know if you're hearing me, and I'm confident you're seeing me. So I just want you to know I want you to let me know if you're hearing me. Let's have a look at the poll we did. Does Trump actually understand the consequences of his actions? No, he has no clue, 76%. Yes, he is causing havoc on purpose, however, 20%. And yes, and he has a convincing plan. So roughly 96% of you don't approve of what Trump is doing, and 4% of you approve. And of the 96 who think that he isn't doing a good thing here, the vast majority think he hasn't got a clue about what he's doing. The rest of you think that he's causing havoc on purpose. It's an interesting question. What do you think that is? Is there perhaps some role for democratic destabilization at home in foreign action of this kind? There's a Russian word associated with Mr. Yeltsin for activities like this called zagagulina, a kind of improvisatory zigzag which you engage in when you want to distract from things in your domestic politics. I'm sure we will touch on that. So let me do the thing that really is our ritual, and that is to scroll up and take the questions that were left by those of you who came earlier. Now, this will mean that we might get to the substance of what's happening at a pace that's dependent on the kind of questions you're asking. It'll mean we're jumping a little bit. We might sometimes take a question that's less, core to this discussion while trying to keep the topic, in sight. Ross, do you think that seeing the Ayatollah taken out will heighten Putin's fear of facing a similar fate himself? Now, the alliance and the depth of the alliance and the depth of the commitment between Russia and Iran in the information environment is generally exaggerated. So what I would do here is make a distinction between the strategic and the psychological. There are some commentators who make a big deal out of Putin's alleged phobia around the way Gaddafi met his end. Other commentators say that that's perhaps exaggerated. I'm of the variety who is more open to the idea that Putin does indeed have a trauma related to Gaddafi and related to Saddam Hussein. The way I work that out, however, is not through evidence. I don't have evidence of Putin, relentlessly watching over and over tapes of what happened to Gaddafi. What I do have is a clear sense of Putin being a man who would psychologically be very triggered by events like these. And so he's going to be very triggered psychologically by this event because he doesn't like when people who are in an analogous position to him lose power in a way that is his ultimately nightmarish scenario for losing power. So psychologically, it's like that for Putin. He doesn't like it. But strategically, this is a lot less important. Unlike Venezuela, he has taken a stronger position on this in the sense that he has said that this is a really bad thing to have done, and that he is expressing commiseration to the people of Iran and regretting the loss to Iran and the loss to Russia-Iran relations of the death of the Ayatollah. But he's not going to let this get in the way of his relationship with Trump. So I think that it's overstated strategically, the significance. It's not going to affect how Russia operates in Ukraine. But I do think emotionally there is something there. So that's how I'd answer that question. Content view, you'll probably address this, but I'll ask it just in case to ensure single-minded, to ensure we can preempt single-minded detractors. How about this question? But Vlad, isn't this a good thing? The world is better off, and this sounds, and you sounding like you've got Trump derangement syndrome. Well, beautiful community. I'm sorry to inform you, we're growing in this room. It's about 480 of us. I think 460 of you, probably including me, have Trump derangement syndrome because not regarding Trump as a normal politician, normally motivated, who processes issues in a normal way, makes you have Trump derangement syndrome, according to lots of people. And I'm afraid then we all meet the diagnosis on that condition. But then the diagnosis of Trump derangement syndrome is just a label you give people who accurately interpret that this guy is not like other politicians we've had before. Though I actually think there is a little bit of truth to Trump derangement syndrome. Yes, I do. And the way that people in resistance liberal circles in the United States develop actual Trump derangement syndrome, something that's worth calling Trump derangement syndrome, is that they think that Trump is simply an aberration caused by immorality and irrationality of the electorate, right? So if you understand none of the social forces that have caused Trump, if you think that Trump is just there because it's an expression of bad behavior from voters plus a little bit of maybe foreign interference, that is TDS. But it's not TDS to say that Trump is an authoritarian out to break institutions, and that he is a vandal both on the foreign and on the local stage, and that he doesn't understand what the hell he's doing. Trump cannot take advice on the issue of Iran. He cannot take advice on the issue of the consequences of his actions. He lives the same day over and over. From Monday to Friday, he could discuss an issue for a long time and yet come out knowing nothing more deeply than he did on Monday. So this is a real problem. So it's not Trump derangement to point out that for all of the insane neoconservative delusion of the Bush administration prior to the Iraq war, they, in their delusional way, planned things out and thought this through. This is not like that at all. This is about spectacle instigated by an impulsive mind who cannot take advice or comprehend the consequences of his own actions. This is why accusations of bellicosity and accusations of neoconservative radicalism here have a sort of place, but also miss the point, because Trump's actions are just not serious enough for that, right? So that's on TDS. In terms of whether this is a good thing, the question must break down into two. Is this good for Iran? And I'm going to conjoin the question of whether it's good for Iran, as in the Iranian people, and whether it's good for Iran in the sense that it makes Iran a more predictable and stable actor regionally and globally, right? So one's the consequence for Iran, and the second's the consequence for the world. The consequence for the world, in my analysis, we already know is very bad, because Trump was negotiating with the Iranians. And by the way, we should not be convinced that what the Iranians were telling their US counterparts was comprehended by their US counterparts or appropriately relayed to Trump, right? So it's possible they didn't even know what they were doing in these negotiations. Now, the negotiations went on, and then Trump said, no, I'm not going to go on with the negotiations. I'm just going to kill you all. Now, that, and you don't need to have 11 PhDs in political philosophy to understand this, is destabilizing for international affairs, because it makes nearly everybody except the closest allies of the United States think, couldn't we be next? And don't we therefore need to hedge against this happening? So this weakens the US role on the global stage. It convinces actors rightly of the unpredictability of the United States. And that kind of decoupling leads to a less stable global environment. Moreover, one thought that you absolutely have if you're a smallish country, or in fact any country that doesn't have nuclear weapons and is witnessing this, is that you must get nuclear weapons. Because North Korea is being shown to be the correct model to deal with this global environment if you're a tyranny, because unless you have nuclear weapons, you're vulnerable to simply being killed, even in the middle of a negotiating process. And then the question arises, who is even a close ally of the United States? Can't they do this to Canada in 2042 under a more radical version of a Trump 3.0? So, and we've got a situation now where Europeans are very concerned about how far the crisis over Trump actually threatening his own allies escalated. And the Europeans have certainly not recovered from the Greenland situation. That a lot of them are trying to brush it under the carpet as though it was a kind of an aberrant detour that we can sort of forget about, but it's not quite possible to do that. So even Trump's allies are going to be thinking, can he do this to us? Or can somebody else do this to us who comes after Trump? So this is profoundly destabilizing for the global environment, and it increases the risk of nuclear war. So can we now say with reasonable certainty that this is bad for the international stage overall? Yes. Can we say that this is bad for Iran? I would say not with the same certainty, no. But even if in the most unlikely event this turned out well for Iran, it's not going to make it. It's not going to make the second and third order global consequences of this good ones. So therefore, we can settle that this is bad, even if it turned out to be good for Iran. Now, what can happen in Iran? You could have essentially a collapse of the regime. You could have a partial fragmentation of a regime that stays in power and is ready to make more concessions to the US. You can have a partial fragmentation of a regime that stays in power and is more bellicose than it ever was. You could have a civil war. I am not a country expert on Iran, right? I have expertise to talk about important trends in global affairs, important trends in political culture, political organization. But country experts don't have great confidence about how these different alternate scenarios are going to play out. So it's quite certain the Trump administration didn't know what they were doing. What I think is quite disgraceful is that many political figures in the West right now are saying, maybe it'll go well, because surely the Americans wouldn't have done it without at least to some extent knowing what they're doing in a way we can't fully see through. Do you know what that reminds one of, beautiful community? It reminds one of the inferred justification that is applied by the Russian population and the Russian soldiers to the Putin regime. We don't know why this war is happening, but Putin hopefully wouldn't have started it unless he knew what he was doing, even though we don't know what it means for him to know what he's doing, because we don't know the process, we don't know the aim, we don't know the aspired to outcomes. So hopefully he wouldn't have done something so radical unless he knew what he was doing. That's the stuff we're hearing regurgitated by folks in public and in private from some Western countries, from Australia to some European countries to Canada. That's absurd because it is so transparent that this is much more about spectacle than steady purpose, even if it's delusional purpose, right? So that's what I'd say about whether it's a good thing. It's certainly a bad thing for global affairs, and it's not clear what the consequences are for Iran, but what we can know is that they have not been thought through by the Trump administration. So they can't even fail, as it were, because they didn't have a clear scenario of what they wanted to happen. Right now, in the last few hours, Trump seems to have again reached for the notion that they might talk to him, whoever they are now. But the fact that they partly decapitated the regime, killed the Ayatollah, is going to generate enormous resentment, and indeed even resentment in much of the Iranian population. There are going to be mixed feelings about what this means in Iran. We have to listen to country experts who complexify the picture for us. Don't forget that it's possible to both hate the regime and hate the American and Israeli attack, which is difficult for us to grasp in this age where algorithms force us to not think of two things at the same time. But whatever happens in Iran, it's not going to be a sort of a strategic failure for the Trump administration because they didn't have a strategy. The strategy was, number one, spectacle and headlines. Number two, shake the regime to the point that it collapses, even though we don't know what it really means to shake it to that point, and we don't know what it looks like for the regime to collapse. And then we just see what happens. When the historical precedent is that air power has virtually never generated constructive regime change, thinking it's going to get you a good result now, especially without thinking through all the scenarios, is absurd. So we can say it's bad for global affairs. We can say that we don't know what the consequences are in Iran. But the point is that it matters that this is about stuff happening in Trump's mind. This is not about serious strategic thought having gone into this. This is really a time to listen to country experts who give us a sort of a complexification of what is going on in Iran domestically. And this is really a time where serious, robust, rigorous, calm, sober journalism is important. And that's what I'm doing. There are parts of the world where, as a political philosopher and baby public intellectual, I have equivalent grasp to country experts. Certainly Russia is one of these countries. Iran is not. And so I'm myself, trying to track what people who can feel where the wind's blowing on the ground are saying. Now, let me tell you a comical story. Just before I got myalgic encephalomyelitis 23 years ago, I think that the last thing I did was just work as a research assistant on a dictionary of the politics and economy of the Middle East. And I wrote letters A to E of that Middle East encyclopedia, and then others wrote other parts, F to Z. And I think that was published under Europa Press. And then unbeknownst to me, it was republished by Routledge, and somehow I had a copy of it in my hands. I was reading it through, and I was thinking, what kind of, this is really, I don't like this. This is terrible. What kind of imbecile wrote that? The balance between historical context and analysis and factuality is all wrong. And this is really crap. I don't know. When I went to look who wrote this, and I realized, oh shit, it's me, because it got re-released under another publisher, and so I've mostly forgotten that too. But I had pretty encyclopedic knowledge of the Middle East, for any name that started from A to E, any name of a person or an organization or an event, and I knew virtually nothing started from F to Z. So this is a time for serious country experts to guide us while themselves retaining a sense of uncertainty. I'll take this very quickly because this is a general question. It's not about Trump or Iran. Otago, can you explain responsibility more? How does responsibility differ from guilt? Does identity change the amount of responsibility? So guilt is connected with the idea of something like blameworthiness for wrongdoing, whereas responsibility can take two forms. It can take the form whereby you're not guilty or blameworthy, but you're involved and you could have handled something better. But it can also have another sense, which is the sense that I try to expand with citizens, and that is what I call fault-free responsibility. And the philosopher Miranda Fricker talks about this very nicely. And I recommend her writings on chats. I'm sure there are chats by Miranda on YouTube on blame. And so let me give you an example of that. Imagine that you're riding a bicycle and that you run over your neighbor's cat with a terminal outcome. You're really upset, but you were riding really safely. You were just on the right side of the road. You were looking around carefully. You weren't listening to your headphones. You weren't speeding. You didn't have your hands, behind your back. You were doing everything right. But the cat just panicked, jumped in front of you, and you just collided in a way that proved extremely unlucky. And, the cat had a difficult outcome. Doesn't matter whether it's seriously injured or you killed it. You did not take any wrong action there, but you're still going to feel bad about what happened. And it's going to mean that you are responsible for what happened without being guilty of anything, because you didn't do anything wrong. You were cycling correctly. But you're implicated, you're ethically involved because it's your bike that collided with the cat. Now magnify this to a much greater level. Imagine that you're driving a bus and this is a child, right? This is going to stay with you for the rest of your life, even though it might be that you were doing impeccable driving and you were looking around and nobody could have in your place prevented what happened. You're still going to be responsible for this outcome. It's not going to be irrational of you to not be able to sleep at night for a while. And somebody of a utilitarian kind might come along and say, well, I'm so sorry, but no, rather somebody of a sort of Kantian disposition might come along and say, look, it's the intent that matters. Your intent was good. You didn't do anything wrong. So please stop worrying about it. You're being irrational. And that's a mistake. You're not being irrational there when you say that you're responsible for this, having not done anything wrong. So what we're doing here is we're opening up the space for fault-free responsibility. That is how I, as a British citizen, to go back to politics, am responsible for the Iraq war, even though in many ways counter to my personality because I don't have an activist personality. But back then, I marched and even organized a little bit against the Iraq war. Um, you know, I didn't just express an opinion or decide how I'd vote. I participated. Had a meeting with my MP. I went to protest. I wrote stuff, whatever. I am responsible for the UK's invasion of Iraq in 2003 because I'm a British citizen. This is fault-free responsibility. That's a very important space. And one of the things that I often tell you, citizens, is feel yourself responsible for the actions of your government that you disagree with. Right? Because if you go like this, that's the psychological behavior of somebody who doesn't share a society with their opponents. Okay, enough on that. Trump has made some statement. Imipak is saying, like, the guys want to talk. What's happening? So we don't know what's happening, but Trump might be thinking that after a day or two of this, having decapitated the regime, that he's going to get whatever is left of the regime to come to him with a softer approach, ready to make many more concessions. We're going to need to see what happens. It seems to me that most country experts would say that the opposite is likely to happen. They're likely to solidify and reflect on the question of what are the pressure points that are going to push Trump into a corner. If we've got the markets being affected, if we've got oil tankers not moving, if we've got US soldiers beginning to lose their lives, as has begun to happen, if we've got several countries in the Middle East being attacked by Iran, not very effectively, but being attacked by Iran, how long can Trump sustain this? And anyway, how many days has he got of capacity to actually keep attacking? Maybe we wait him out. We wait until he begins to crumble under pressure. So don't make the mistake that just because Trump has attacked Iran, decapitated the regime, that they're necessarily going to come back, that whatever is left of the regime is going to turn to Trump with a softer approach. It could be the other way around. Imipak, thank you very much. You're referring to my video on the main channel about Thomas Mann and political responsibility. So I advise anybody who hasn't seen it, who wants to know that distinction between guilt by association and responsibility by association, go and watch that. That's going to be a good 15 minutes of your time. And a lot of people have given me positive feedback on that video. Bennett is asking a good question. Do the actions of the US hamper Iran's potential democratic future? The answer is we don't know. But even if they didn't, even if there were greater democratic credentials than there are to this aerial attempt to do regime change, it still wouldn't make this a move that's worth supporting for its second and third order global consequences. What would be the consequences, Failtier is asking, for the post-World War II international order? Well, that order is disintegrating anyway. It would have been disintegrating if Trump never attacked Iran. But what would be the consequences for that order if US and Israel, uh, if their plan would work? There is no chance that their plan works. There is no plan. We've said that we've got the spectacle addict Trump on the one side. And then we have the post-truth authoritarian Netanyahu. Netanyahu needs fireworks to stabilize himself in domestic power. There is also an element for Netanyahu of striking Iran when it's weak. But that's not all there is to it. There is also fireworks for the purposes of regime security. These guys do not have a plan. So there is no chance that their plan works out. What there is a chance of is that the cacophony of domestic consequences in Iran lean more in a constructive rather than a destructive direction, more than most expect. Sure, that's possible. But that would still be a weakening of the global, whatever is left of the global order, which isn't much, but you can still weaken what's left of it, simply because, as we said earlier, it's important to make a distinction between outcome for Iran and outcome for the international stage as a whole. Tuju, Vlad, do you think the fact that they got Khamenei to give that they got to Khamenei gives Trump any new leverage when negotiating with Putin in Ukraine? No, absolutely none at all. This favors Putin, even though Putin is going to be allergic to this happening. But this roughly favors Putin because it's a normalization of, I don't like this regime. I've got the power to attack it and take it out. I'm going to give that a go. So this absolutely normalizes what Putin is doing. Let me add something else. The European reaction, but especially the Australian and the Canadian reaction, the Australian and the Canadian reaction has been to approve of what Trump is doing, absolutely normalizes what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. When the joint statement from the UK, France, and Germany essentially leaves room for Trump to engage in this activity, we've got a problem. When that statement calls for Iran to stop attacking neighbors in the region, but doesn't call on the United States to stop attacking Iran, we've got a completely ludicrous situation. Because these people sound like they are saying something that cannot be squared with what they're saying about Ukraine. What they've said about Iran needing to stop attacking actors in the region without having asked the United States to stop attacking Iran sounds like telling Ukraine to stop attacking Russia. Now, it's a bit more complex than that, and Ukraine hasn't done anything wrong and is a victim, and Iran is a loathsome and aggressive state engaged in all kinds of unlovely activities across the globe. But the point is, Iran is only attacking several countries in the Middle East because Israel and the United States are attacking it. And so it's positively Orwellian to omit that from the statement. And when you omit it, then countries in the so-called global South, voters in Western nations think, well, if they're producing such Orwellian porridge about this, how can we trust them on what they're saying on Ukraine? So there's a real problem here, and that's how you've got to think about it. You can't just say, oh, goody, maybe something good happens in Iran and we'll see how that goes. The point is that global conflicts are interconnected. Mobilization of different actors to partake more or less constructively in different global conflicts is connected. If you say nothing about how what the Israelis and the Americans are doing is a bit aggressive, and then you uh, outrightly condemn the Russians, your condemnation of the Russians looks weaker, right? So this is a real problem. It's extraordinary that France, the UK, and Germany released a statement which basically asked Iran to stop firing on neighboring countries in the region as though they never got attacked by Israel and the United States. The problem is that there are no, if you like, causally exhaustive walls between one issue and another. You might say, well, hey, I don't like the Iranian regime. They are organizing um, various kinds of terror activities on our soil, which is absolutely true. They're a horrendous, bloodthirsty regime, a sheer illegitimate monstrosity. We want to get rid of them. So why don't we do a little bit of Orwellian speak and just get behind Trump doing this? The trouble is you can't insulate that from your other positions on other policy issues. That's the problem. You cannot act in a vacuum here. Speaking is acting in high-powered politics, of course. So we've got a problem here, which is that the United States and Israel are attacking Iran. God knows what's going to happen in Iran. Iran is doing very limited strikes on several actors in the Middle East. Meanwhile, the Europeans are sitting around releasing mixed up statements with an Orwellian twinge, and are saying that they're going to have various kinds of meetings about this in a day or two. That weakens our discourse about how important it is to protect Ukraine. Then there is another point, and that's that Iran is an absolute disgrace of a state. It's a very violent and ominous and illegitimate regime, but it quite certainly, unless there is something we don't know, and there almost certainly isn't, it almost certainly posed no imminent threat to Israel, let alone the United States. Do you know who poses a significant threat to the security of the United States and Europe? Russia. But Trump is friendly with Russia. Russia has eaten up a part of a European country. Russia has bombed to oblivion a part of a European country. Russia wants to gain full control over a part of a European country. Russia wants to redefine security arrangements on the European space together with China. That's a regional and a global security threat. There is a prospect of Russia engaging in a low threshold challenge of Article 5 in the next 2 or 3 years. There is nothing remotely equivalent by way of a threat that Iran presents to us. That's another challenge, because if you make out a regime that does not present an imminent threat as presenting an imminent threat, you can't then go on and talk about regimes that genuinely present a bigger threat or a more imminent threat without being disbelieved by a lot of people. So that's another problem. But to circle back to what I just said earlier, it's extremely distrust inducing for Western citizens in different Western countries when their governments in private and then in public take positions of a somewhat Orwellian kind about what's happening, whereby they're just pretending that Iran is attacking countries in the Middle East out of the blue. If you omit the point that Israel and the United States are engaged in this attack and that you have to take a position on it, you undermine your conceptualization of every other conflict where your conceptualization matters and you're trying to persuade your citizens of something. Because if you speak that kind of ludicrous nonsense, your voters are going to say, even when you make sense, maybe you're still speaking ludicrous nonsense. I'm not going to believe you. Stump zip, to what extent do you think Trump's actions are shaping operations for potential Chinese conflict? Not to any real extent. Trump saw Venezuela as good spectacle. He got giddy on how he felt it worked well. That persuaded him now to move to Iran. He's getting a bit giddy on the spectacle of it. There is a good question how far he could still, you know, convince himself that this is a lovely spectacular for him, no matter what happens in Iran as a consequence of his actions. But this is much more chaotic, much less serious than the kind of strategic approach that your question proposes. Again, I emphasize this one more time. This is not strategic insanity. This is not like Tony Blair sitting around 2002 and asking experts, but Saddam, but he is evil, isn't he? But he is evil, isn't he? To which the answer is, yes, he is, but nothing follows from that about how you are going to create positive consequences by taking the country over. This isn't that. This is not giddy, maniacal, neocon mystical delusion. This is much more banal. This is much more transactional, and this is much more about spectacle and theater. We can't at this point judge, with historical record, we might have an ability to judge how far this is also about distracting from domestic political issues like Epstein. I don't want to overstate that case now, but it's certainly a legitimate question. But what I am saying is that this is not a poorly thought through strategic move um, to do with delusion, to do with ideological overreach. Um, this is more superficial than that, less serious than that, more buffoonish than that. And I think that distinction matters, both for how we understand what Trump might do next, and both for how we understand the consequences. Um, Western officials who are privately saying in the last day or two that they hope that there is more of a strategy behind what Trump has done than it looks like there is from the outside are delusional and engaged in wishful thinking. So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying there isn't a strategy there that is quite incompatible with reality. I'm saying this is too unserious to be thought of as the kind of strategic action that we saw in 2003. Don't forget, um, there was very, very considerable thought and very, very considerable preparation that went into the invasion of Iraq. It was just wildly unrealistic. But that serious application of thought and attention was there. This is absent now. This is lightweight stuff, largely driven by impulsive dispositional states of the president. Okay, I think we've probably covered our ethical duty, and our ethical duty has been to cover the questions that were left ahead of time. Now, we're going to do a bit of catching up. Let's do a few super chats. Does this further isolate Putin, since this might disrupt Iranian support for Russia's war? Iranian support is diminished for Russia's war. It doesn't disrupt Putin in any significant way. I would downplay essentially on all counts the impact on Russia's war in Ukraine. By way of something negative that's a spanner in the works for Putin, except just in psychological terms. So the only way this might affect Russia is actually Putin sitting there thinking, you know what, I've got to tweak my dial of repression a little bit more because stuff gets scary out there. Vlad goes on about sanewashing Trump, yet many still don't get it. They fail to comprehend Trump's personality. It's very difficult. And in fact, a lot of people who say that Trump is nutty don't capture it right. I mean, I'm hearing a lot of people talk about dementia, whereas in fact, the primary driver of what's going on is A, narcissistic personality deformation, and B, neurodiversity that generates a kind of rigidity and impulsivity that is often amazing in the way it helps a lot of people live their lives. It also makes it difficult, but also gives some superpowers. But in Trump's case, because he has the narcissistic personality deformation, it's fueled by his neurodiversity. And that's why he's incapable to take advice, incapable to ask for advice, incapable to hear anything. You can talk at him about Iran for a month, and at the end of the month, he's going to be exactly where he was before on Iran. He's not going to know anymore. You know, and that here are these stories that Anthony Scaramucci tried to show Trump films in order to do storytelling around the Middle East, so you could actually wake up and absorb some information. So most people are still sanewashing Trump, and the people who say he's nutty go on about dementia, which is just not the point. And it's embarrassing, quite frankly, especially when professional psychologists do this. Is highly embarrassing that they're not seeing the narcissistic personality disorder in some cases, and in most cases, not seeing the neurodiversity. Without that, you can't properly explain him. So we've got this kind of 2-point breakdown. One, some people are over strategizing Trump. Neil Ferguson, literally minutes before I went on, or maybe hours, wrote a thread saying how clever some of the thought is behind Trump's attack on Iraq. And it's just embarrassing for a man in his 60s to be saying that with Neil's background. And I still recommend a lot of Neil's early work. Neil's book, The Cash Nexus, is an absolutely marvelous commentary on the excessive weight we historically give to economic determinism. Is a beautiful writer as well. And is still very smart and wonderful to listen to, but this is entirely unserious. It's not a mistake when Neil says that. It's unserious. So there's that group of people who are trying to say Trump's got some really good strategy here. Then there are the people who say we've got to talk about what's wrong with Trump, but then don't exactly nail that. So we've got these two things we've got to keep getting right. Chester, we talk about the social forces that bring about democratic decline, but in light of the Iranian protests, what forces need to be present to bring about the opposite in an autocratic state? So you're raising something very important. How do you square the fact that many people in Iran, it's not overstate this, but many people in Iran want to get rid of the tyranny that asphyxiates them? And yet, Brits and Americans are happy to vote for political candidates like Farage and Trump, who are going to undermine their democracy. Doesn't mean that Britain and America will become Iran, but it'll mean Britain and America will become Hungary. So, how come people in one place are fighting for something, risking their lives for something, losing their lives for something, that other people are just ready to lose while sitting around in their bums watching TV in better scenarios, in worse scenarios, just working hard, being overwhelmed, feeling behind with everything, feeling fearful about how you make a living, and then just not paying attention to politics. How do you square that? Well, you square it like this. There are all kinds of social forces that are causing the materials needed for the sustenance of trust in any society to break down. Social media is causing that, absolutely. The untethering of social bonds in our society is causing that. We're more atomized, we're less connected at the community level, at an intergenerational level. We have got profound economic and political exclusion. People feel that they just can't touch politics, they can't inflect the political process, and people feel that they have been just stranded by globalization, not asked about it, and stranded by it without any capacity to influence it. And then we've also got many ideologies of self realization, which makes us think about the welfare of groups detached from the context of the public good, solidarity, and the value of citizenship as something to which we all belong, no matter what our more particular identities are. All of that is devastating trust. That's true. But at the same time, it's also true that humans don't like being ruled by somebody they can't kick out of power. Humans don't like going to court and knowing that the outcome is settled and arbitrary in favor of the regime. Humans don't like knowing that they can't say what they think in public without going to prison. Nobody likes that. You don't need to be Danish to dislike that. If you're Chinese, if you're Iranian, if you're North Korean, you don't like it. You might have a lot of false consciousness, which makes you sort of justify how that's actually okay, but you still don't like it. If you were properly informed, you wouldn't like it. And so it's important that we recognize that both of these things are true. What's absolutely frustrating, however, is that the crisis of trust in the West is getting people to vote for political arrangements which they themselves are going to resent because they leave them unfree. And that's a difficult thing. And we've got to talk about it seriously without just voter shaming and saying these people are idiots. They're not idiots. They're losing trust. They have a lack of a sense of political agency. They need to be empowered and included and heard and not just told to wise up. But that's how you square these two things. People are still risking their lives in the world to have a government over which they have a say. And many of us in the West are sitting around and positively encouraging political parties that are going to break our democratic institutions. Both things are happening at once, and we can explain why both things are happening at once. And we also worryingly can observe that the end state of democratic decline might be a situation where the very people who voted in the actors who brought this about then feel like they're oppressed by, a completely legitimate regime they need to get rid of. Chester, what would be the European reaction if military confrontation with Russia occurred? It depends on what you mean by military confrontation. If a full-scale conventional war occurred between Russia and Europe, Russia would lose. So, and there's no reason to expect why that would occur. There is no chance, because this also risks getting over-egged. So let's be clear about this. There is virtually no chance that there's going to be a full-scale war between Russia and NATO in the next 10 years. Virtually no chance. So it is hyperbole when European officials say we're going to be at war with Russia, if you interpret that as meaning there's going to be one army and another army and they're going to go like that, which is what we're seeing on Ukraine, but in a multi-theater scenario. If you mean what's going to happen if Russia attacks Western troops in the Baltics and kills some of them, that's a more realistic question. But Russia wouldn't attack them to get into a war with Europe. Russia would attack them to bring it about that Europe does nothing and that way undermines itself. Right? So if we put the question like this, what's going to be the Western reaction to a low threshold challenge of Article 5? And we actually should be quite nuanced about what Article 5 means. It's not as definite as most people take it to be. But if what you're talking about is a low threshold Russian challenge to Article 5 somewhere in Finland or in the Baltics, and the United States does nothing, what will Europe do is the question. Will it be closer to full escalatory response, commensurate with whatever the Russians did, or will it be an underreaction, closer to nothing? The answer is probably the latter. We don't know, but it's probably the latter, and that's what the Russians are gambling on. Well, the Baltics are none of our business. We're France, after all. So that's more likely. And Putin knows that he only would be open to challenging Article 5 if he had capacity to de-escalate in response to whatever the West does. But his hope would be that he wouldn't need to de-escalate because they wouldn't do anything in response. So Putin's aim of challenging Article 5 would be not to cause, but to avoid a major war with NATO. So when we talk about Russia going to war with NATO, what we're effectively talking is quite certainly not a proper war between Russia and NATO, but a kind of challenge to Article 5 that perhaps should lead to a certain NATO reaction, doesn't, and because it doesn't, causes further dissolution of the alliance and domestic democratic decline at home. Don't forget, when the alliances that you are a member of melt down, that completely undermines your political legitimacy at home too. And so if Putin attacked the Baltics, his aim would not be to capture a part of Estonia or to capture Estonia. His aim would be that France, Germany, and the UK stop being democracies. Hussein is saying, I'm afraid if the regime survives, all the anger it has will be channeled inward towards the opposition. It's very difficult for me to comment in detail on this because I'm simply not a country expert, and there are marvelous country experts who actually don't have enough of an audience right now as we speak. But what I will say is that there are all kinds of calamitous scenarios that are entirely domestically realistic in Iran, which bring it about that what Trump and the Israelis have done is going to retard rather than advance Iran's journey toward more legitimate political arrangements. It could go the other way, but as I say, that would only be a kind of a turn of luck for Trump and the Israelis. They don't have a strategy about how to cause or how to manage the variegated scenarios that might ensue. So it's absolutely responsible to worry about what you're worrying about. Daniel is asking, could Netanyahu try to continue to escalate the Iran conflict? Do you mean if the United States no longer wishes to continue, but Israel does? I can't say anything about military capacity, of course, but I can absolutely tell you that this is not just Iran being picked on for being a danger to Israel while it is in a weak moment, while Iran is in a weak moment. This is also a regime security operation for Netanyahu, whereby the threat to Netanyahu is not Iran, but the Israeli people. Okay. 73% of you have said that Trump has no clue what he's doing, which just shows that you're biased and you have severe Trump derangement syndrome, like me. It's a beautiful community. I don't know what we're going to do with this derangement syndrome. I propose we seek help from the psychological professions. A couple of military questions. I'm going to be disciplined. I'm not qualified to answer them. When I lived in Israel for 4 years, as a child, I became obsessed with military aviation and learned everything there was to know about US planes and US missiles and US aircraft carriers. And this is actually worth saying about Israel, because Israel is obviously directly involved in this. When I was in Israel as a child for 4 years, and by the way, when I came to the UK from Israel in 1994, my preferred language was Hebrew. So I wasn't just a sort of outsider there, I was quite immersed. And what I got myself into, and by the time I left Israel, I sort of snapped out of it. And I was 9 to 12, something like that, when I was there. I got a bit giddy on Israel's sense of its precarity. Israel's history suggests an understandable feeling of precarity, of course. But that feeling of precarity is also exaggerated and takes a psychotic form in many Israeli citizens, right? We don't just go around criticizing the Russian citizens here. We're going to criticize all citizens, American citizens too. And that expresses itself in the feeling that Israel is under existential threat when it isn't. It might just be under threat, but you feel it is under existential threat. And moreover, you somehow find something cozy about feeling that Israel is under existential threat. You know? So kind of the 10-year-old, 11-year-old me would be sitting around in, bomb shelters thinking, oh, that's a bit romantic. You know, a lot of my classes would have been in bomb shelters. I remember being near the Golan Heights and looking at the capsized military machinery and being able to date it to the 67 war or to the 1973 war and feeling a physiological rush, a kind of emotional titillation, almost of the sort that children feel when they are chased but not caught. It felt exhilarating. So that feeling of precarity in Israel is exaggerated and spiritualized. When you go to Tel Aviv and you're in a nightclub in Tel Aviv and you just see people, drinking beer, it kind of feels like it's a sort of a blend between the United States and a Mediterranean country. And it kind of is and it kind of isn't. There's a real quasi mystical, quasi spiritual feeling about Israel's destiny and Israel's survival through precarity and the romanticism of all of that secular Israelis feel, not just ultra Orthodox folks. So it's very important. And the psychotic element comes in when you grasp terrible and appalling things that happen to you, that are done to you by others, like the grotesque barbarism of October 7th, but you don't grasp what Israel is doing in Gaza. Or what you see a lot now on Israeli social media, where Israel has attacked Iran and Israelis are getting into bomb shelters and going, look what we have to deal with. That's psychotic. That's like punching your neighbor and being hit back and thinking that you got struck first and crying about it. So that element which I myself as a child entertained when I was shared, but partook in, um, of a balance between precarity and the um, spiritualization of the coziness of precarity. Yeah? That's a very important element in Israeli society. A lot of Israelis are immune from it. And in fact, some of the smartest and most sophisticated and most empathetic people toward what's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza are Israelis themselves. There's different kinds of Israelis, yeah, but um, there is nevertheless that cultural pathology. So when we talk about cultural pathology, we're talking about tendencies. We're not talking about what everybody in the country thinks. There's always um, the possibility to say yes, there is a tendency, but also there's going to be huge numbers of exceptions. And that's important to understand when you think of how um, um, escalatory Israeli conduct um, can be got away with, um, even in the eyes of citizens who are not natural Netanyahu supporters. And let me then say something about the United States. It is not quite right to say, as the polls suggest, that most Americans do not like what is happening. I think there is a truth to that, but the bigger truth is that the US population is depoliticized and overwhelmingly is disengaged from what Trump is doing in the Middle East now. And even the people who are vehemently opposed to Trump are, in many cases, mostly seeing what he's doing as the actions of some kind of clown who has been elevated by a clownish political system into a position of power and is doing clownish things. And um, that can't even be made sense of. So let me get on with my life. Let me get on with making sure I'm surviving. And let me make sure that I'm entertained and that I've got some power to consume things I enjoy to consume. So there is a lot of consumerist detachment in the US population about this from supporters and opponents of Trump. And there is more of that than would have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. So it's important to not overstate this case that American citizens are preponderantly opposed to what Trump is doing, and that's therefore going to hit him really hard. What is the solution, Cheryl is asking, to interstate male warfare? Calling them names like narcissists won't work. They invented male gods, many of whom were bloodthirsty. So I'm a feminist, and I believe we don't see and hear and center women enough, and we don't understand the value of women leaders enough in our culture. Sure. But I wouldn't dramatize the difference between men and women quite as widely as you are doing it. There is a tendency to say, for instance, look at the countries who have recently been led by women, and can't you see that they're often saner and more stable and more responsible? I would invert that. These countries are tendentiously not stable and saner and more responsible because they're led by women. They're led by women because they are genuinely stable, saner, and more responsible. That's an important point that we often miss. Do not underestimate how destructive women can be in relations mediated by institutions that we share. You've written this comment, but if in 2070 two women um, start a strategic nuclear exchange that ends civilization on Earth, what will you say then? Because then the historical record will be that nobody's destroyed as many lives in the history of human beings as these two figures who are female, not male. So I think that there are going to be a lot of things said in your favor as we discuss this point more deeply, which we can't do now. But don't underestimate the destructive capacity of women mediated by institutions they share. We had Liz Truss, a very destructive, she's a Trump supporter, in fact, a very destructive and grossly irresponsible prime minister only recently in the UK, and she was female. I'd probably take a female leader over a male leader, all things being equal, yeah. But we also must not push this too far. Thank you so much for your comments and questions. As you can appreciate, I can't take them all. By the way, I've never said this in about 3 or 4 years. If you're in the room, it helps. I think it helps the live if you click the like button. There you go. My first call to action in 3 or 4 years on YouTube. Except for my calls at the end of main channel videos, where I say, beautiful community, we have discussed oat milk. But you can't understand oat milk unless you also learn about almond milk. And to explore the true meaning of almond milk, watch this video next. You've been tormented by that, haven't you, beautiful community? Especially right at the beginning, 2 or 3 years ago, we had the cyclicality. I'm a bit behind. I'm just trying to catch up and I'm looking out for questions. Martin is asking, so many on the political right are cosplaying some sort of freedom fighters while the policies promote unfreedom. Why is there so much confusion as to what this is in reality? It's very important that what's happened to a lot of people on the right is that they've stopped being on the right, they've become authoritarians. So a lot of people on the right are authoritarians who are wearing conservative clothes but are no longer conservatives, because a conservative does not want to smash institutions. A conservative does not want to control what Harvard University teaches or what a judge decides or what a journalist says. When you see people doing that, tell them and tell others around them, you are not a conservative. You are a revolutionary authoritarian. Vlad, Michael is asking, do you believe that European officials actually believe Russia's future imperialism, or are they cynically providing rationale for increased defense production? So most European leaders do not want to increase defense production. It's against their nature, and they're doing it reluctantly, and they know it's not very popular. So the form, the question that you're asking then would take is, do they, while believing Russia is the real threat, exaggerate the Russian threat to justify the defense spending, or reformulate it into something more simplistic? The answer is often yes, and I'm opposed to that. So, for example, when a European official says, well, you know, if we're not careful, people in Europe, in Western Europe, are going to be speaking Russian in 10 years, that actually undermines us taking the Russian threat seriously, because it blinds us to the kind of complex reality we just tried to, hypothetical reality we just tried to sketch earlier, about a low threshold challenge to Article 5 by the Russians. So we've got to take the Russian threat realistically, because if we talk baloney about it, then the people who don't believe there's a Russian threat at all are going to come over and say, well, hey guys, you're just speaking BS, because nobody's going to speak Russian. The chances of Russia and the UK being in a direct full-scale war in the next 10, 20 years are close to zero. So that's not the threat. The threat is that Russia is going to do something delimited that undermines, perhaps in its entirety, whatever is left of the NATO alliance, and undermines Western democracies in their domestic functioning. So that's very different to, we're going to have a really big war with the Russians. Because then somebody comes along and says, what kind of big war are you talking about? Because the Russians have literally advanced at a snail's pace in Ukraine. So how are they going to take over Western Europe? They're not. So that's why taking the Russian threat seriously requires that complexification. Otherwise, you sound like a nutcase, and you're going to be easily outmaneuvered by ex-conservative authoritarians who are sympathetic to Putin and want to ally with him and claim that you're just making exaggerated claims. So it's important for us to be on solid ground here and not say things that are completely unrealistic. Crises such as war in the Middle East, Natrum Sullivan is asking, crises such as war in the Middle East, severe economic inequality, and now the Epstein situation highlights democratic decline. Will authoritarians use anti-Semitism as an excuse for these crises? So I made a video on the chat channel about a year ago about what anti-Semitism is and what it's not. And I'm afraid the answer is yes. Even though it requires us to keep many things in mind at the same time, we should be extremely critical of the destruction of Gaza that Israel insupportably and unaccountably and needlessly generated. But that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism isn't rife. And often what triggers anti-Semitism is, in fact, particular types of actions that are themselves unjustifiable. So you've got an unjustifiable action and then an unjustifiable reaction to that action. This is difficult for us to keep in mind in this age where we want to think in binary ways. Anti-Semitism is rife, it's growing. Islamophobia is rife and it's growing too, right? Again, keeping two things in mind at the same time. They work very differently. I'll be talking about how they're different, but absolutely in the 2030s, anti-Semitism will be widely used by Western governments as a political lever, and we've got to take it very seriously. And we've got to analyze it very seriously. I'm going to understand what it entails and what it doesn't entail. We don't want to end up in a ludicrous position where we just, any kind of criticism of Israel is taken to be anti-Semitic. But we also don't want to say that there is no such thing as anti-Semitism. There is, and it's a big problem. So we will be helping ourselves on this journey of keeping different and difficult things in mind at the same time. Somebody's saying conservatism no longer has a meaning in the US. Yes, this is a real problem. We're experiencing the political death of conservatism. Can you please explain the mechanism by which violence becomes not just metaphorically, but loosely sexualized or eroticized? I don't want to go in a big tangents. Let me just say one thing, that proximity to violence gives people an intensified sense, hello, Nico, an intensified sense of reality. It's a bit like looking under the carpet of existence. It's extremely visceral and can therefore have a kind of transcendent liberatory feeling and can easily lock humans into being addicted to it for its own sake. And it's that ultimately real sense of removing the veneer, the film between you and life, that can feel so compelling and so physiologically activating. Like the world is speaking to all of your body. That's the direction of that conversation. JB says, so wonderful to see you. Good to see you. Farmer's daughter. Good to see you. What is Trump's actual fantasy? Trump's actual fantasy is that when he does this, he is thinking about being seen by the world's attention in a particular light. When he does events, he likes the bombast and theatricity of the events, but he likes even more the bombast and theatricity of the attention he receives as a consequence of the events. That feeds his needs. So when I say this is about fantasy, what I'm saying is that for Trump, this is often about the reception of his actions as much as it is about the actions themselves. And even when it comes to the actions themselves, what often matters is the theatricity of the actions rather than the strategic substance of the actions. So the bombs were big. We attacked that in a way nobody's done before. It was devastating like nobody thought would be possible. That's Trump's emotional relationship with what is happening. It's not, there are 11 scenarios for what might happen in Iran as a consequence. These three are the most likely. Can we do what we're doing in a slightly different way to inflect the gap in probability between the different scenarios that we might ensue? Can we get a deeper understanding of this? Is what we're doing really justified? Can can it work in accordance with how we think the consequences might develop? That's not what Trump does. NXS, why does Putin hate Western democracy? Putin, strictly speaking, does not hate Western democracy. He thinks democracy doesn't exist. All relations of opposition, which are relations of cooperation through opposition and opposition through cooperation, are for Mr. Putin just relations of enemies in disguise. And so, what triggers him so much about democracy is that he thinks that it's not real. In other words, he thinks the UK, it's just Russia in disguise. When you watch the BBC and the BBC says something, he thinks that Keir Starmer told it to say that very, very roughly. That's how primitively his mind works about this. So he conceptually doesn't grasp that there is such a thing as a relation of opposition, where you and I are political opponents, but we don't want to destroy one another. We're playing a political game of tennis, but we don't want to bash each other over the head with a tennis racket. Putin thinks that even if it looks like a tennis match, deep down, the two people just want to bash themselves on the head and, in fact, are moving toward that scenario. So it's not that he thinks it's bad, it's that he thinks it's fraudulent. And it doesn't really exist. And what's bad about it is that it's something pretending to be something that it isn't. And he's very, very triggered by that. Krillin is saying Trump is a narcissist with dementia. I want to emphasize particularly the narcissist bit. I do think that there's a little bit of age and senility coming in, but it's still primarily a combination of narcissism as a personality deformation plus neurodiversity just triggering the narcissism more. But you're right about that impulsivity. You're saying he's thinking 48-hour slots. He's not thinking 48-hour slots. He's thinking in 8-second slots. And he would have had 77 thoughts already since he attacked Iran about, oh, maybe you should stop it now, do something else. Maybe just can we talk to them now? Oh, can we attack them in some new way? But could we change something over? I've had enough of this. I need the new thing. I've had enough of right. So there is that kind of impulsivity. Give me something new. I'm no longer entertained by this. Do we think Trump has the balls to turn against his Moscow boss? I don't think he has a boss in Moscow. I think that its language is very widely used in this community, but it's much worse than that. I mean, watch my video on the main channel. Trump is not a Russian asset, it's worse. Trump is an ally of Moscow. He's not an asset of Moscow, he's an ally of Moscow. The asset requires you to think that if only you get rid of the element of Russian interference in your society, Trump's and the phenomenon of Trump would go away. No, your society produced it. Take responsibility. Don't run away from it like Russians are running from the responsibility of the war. If you're American, you produced this stuff, even if you voted against it. Just like my society produced the Iraq War, and I produced the Iraq War, even though I organized against it. It's about taking responsibility, right? Even for things that involve no fault of your own. So he doesn't have a boss in Moscow. He has an ally in Moscow, ideologically an ally. They ally on might is right, what I call hyper neoliberalism. They ally on certain elements of fascism, but limitedly. Trump, especially, is more limited than Putin on fascism. And they ally on monarchism, the idea that the guy in the top should have nothing in his path when he's trying to make decisions. Trump is also narcissistically dependent on Putin. He admits himself and Putin jointly in a society to which only very privileged members belong, of which Putin and Trump are two. So, narcissistic dependence, ideological allyship, not boss and servant. It's too complacent, it's too easy to say Moscow boss. I'm not going to ban you from saying it. In fact, you could just say Moscow boss is a shorthand for ideological ally and being narcissistically dependent on Putin. Then it's okay. But if you literally mean that he's a puppet, um, that's you not taking responsibility for the organic thing that your polity has produced if you are in the United States. Nico, the way journalists talk about Trump, they make his motives more complicated than they really are. Yeah, I mean there was a thing a few months ago when Trump was asked, "Are you going to put more sanctions on Russia?" Or something like that, and he said, "Mm," and just walked off. And several journalistic institutions ran the headline, "Trump commits to escalating sanctions on Russia," which is just unfathomable sanewashing. And also, Trump is not a liar, he is a post truth populist. We know about this from how we speak about the Russian regime, who flood the informational environment with contradictory claims, right? They say, we didn't do this in Ukraine, somebody else did, or we did, we were forced to, however, or no, we didn't, but it was the Americans, or the globalist elite did it, or the planet Saturn did it, or no, it didn't, but its rings did. Trump does the same, you know? So, you know, I wasn't eating a banana, I was eating a peach. I wasn't eating a banana, I was eating an apple. Or I wasn't eating anything, I was climbing a mountain. Or I wasn't climbing a mountain, um, I was in the swimming pool. And so you've got 4 or 5 incompatible claims about the same event. And then news organizations, each time the incompatible claim is made, say Trump commits to the story that he had an apple and not a banana or whatever. We can't keep doing that. We need institutionally to readjust and teach journalists both the clarity and the safety that they need to be able to say, this is the latest chain in a set of mutually contradictory proclamations infused by fleeting dispositional states the president of the United States has. This is not the latest commitment he has made on Tuesday morning, which is going to contradict on Tuesday afternoon and again contradict on Tuesday evening. Mary, Vlad, thank you for your work. Thank you back. Would you consider going on the Bulwark? Yes, of course they do. They do great stuff. You've reviewed a video of them interviewing Sam Harris. Yes, I must have done ages ago. For health reasons, I've stopped going on other people's platforms, but I'm trying to find ways to do that more. And so in the next few months, I'm going to be more open, I hope, to invites, even if it means visiting from bed and sometimes visiting on oxygen. How does Trump decide who gets into a magical society and who doesn't? Trump decides that by seeing if that person exists in his world. And if that person exists in his world, the way Putin exists and Zelensky doesn't exist in Trump's world, that means that that person is perceived, at least by many, as having very considerable power and a lot of sort of valorizing attention of various kinds, that they're elevated and that they're perceived as strong or powerful or mysterious. Above all, Trump is attracted to people whose action is unencumbered. Right? Putin could just postpone the next election in Russia because it's fake anyway. Actually, that would be a lot harder for Putin to do than you might guess, but Trump thinks he can do that, whereas Trump knows that he can't. For Trump, it's not to say he isn't going to try, but it'd be very difficult for him to stay for a third term. Um, but that's easy for Putin, and Trump Trump loves that, and he wants to be um, jointly perceived as, you know, somebody who um, is in the same fantasy society of um, monarchs with magical and extraordinary powers like democratic leaders don't have. That's why it's so precious for him to bathe in Putin's glow, even though Putin praises Trump a lot less than European leaders do. Graham says, Vlad and Anna from Ukraine again, please. Um, Anna did a video with a few people like Anders Bach Nielsen and me speaking for 2 or 3 minutes about the 4 years of war. What excludes Zelensky so much? Zelensky is a democratic leader. Zelensky is also Jewish. And Zelensky is an obstacle in the way of Trump's fantasy about allowing the peacock's tail of the full possibilities of his uh, dynamic with Putin to flourish, right? Because if we stop the war, then I'd be able to do all kinds of magical business with Putin. And don't forget, Trump is thinking about Iran the same way. Trump is literally thinking right now, can I own some of Iran? And by that, I don't mean can the United States own some of Iran? Can I privately own some of Iran? So there is this kind of individualistic, hyper neoliberal colonial dimension to Trump's fantasies about Iran. Who are the runners as successors to Putin? Zeddy is asking. At the moment, there couldn't be any that are visible because Putin would then remove them. And so, what that creates is a situation where the succession process is uh, completely underdetermined and completely uncontrollable by Putin. So, Putin is not going to appoint a successor and be able to control the transfer of power. So it's going to necessarily create a certain kind of vacuum when Putin is gone. You can say if you lose things, right, about perhaps the younger generation of people in the regime, but there are always so many surprises that spring up when a transfer of power begins. All that we can say for sure is that Putin is currently coup-proofing his regime, and that he is asking himself the question, what are the people I want to have, what's the human material I want to have around me for a time when my regime destabilizes? Who am I going to trust to button down the hatches when things get wobbly? So Putin is already beginning to maneuver people in his regime in light of that anticipatory thinking about the uncontrollability of the transition beyond himself. Also, don't forget, back to Zelensky, it's not just that he is in charge of a power that's getting in the way of Trump's relationship with Russia and that he's Jewish. It's also important that he is short, which is weird because it's not important for Trump that Putin is short, but that Zelensky is short is important for Trump. Yeah, Trump is, in my assessment, selectively anti-Semitic. He's not systematically anti-Semitic, though. When we talk about prejudice, they don't have to take a belief, kind of doxastic belief-based form. I dislike everybody who belongs to group X. most prejudice in the world today operates at the level of images. You might say, well, I believe all people who are members of that group are equals to everybody else, but I still have sort of images of how they're not quite right, they're not quite there, they're not quite trustworthy enough, they're not quite, reliable enough, they're not quite well motivated enough. And these are images you have, but they're not expressed at the level of belief. I know this is a hard question Mudamlock is asking to answer, but do you think that there's a small chance of Iran becoming more liberal as a result of this, rather than entering a civil war mess? Um, it's important that you're talking to somebody who, wrote that dictionary of the Middle East letters A to E and knew nothing E to Z. And that was 25 years ago, and I've even forgotten all the A to E. So I'm not a country expert. Country experts are going to be able to talk about this more. What I can say is that notionally, yes, it's possible that there are uh, better and more democratic credentials promoting outcomes than in Iran, than the conventional expectation of most realistic people about this suggests. That's possible. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. It doesn't mean it's likely, but it's possible. The only way it would be impossible, as opposed to just very unlikely, is if there were not just natural laws that apply to the workings of society, scientific laws, but social scientific laws. And there are no social scientific laws. Right? Which is why especially at radical moments of transformation, there is so much uncertainty. Right? So you're asking, could this go a bit worse or a bit better? The answer is absolutely for Iran. But even if it went better for Iran, this wouldn't be better for the world. Because as we've said right at the beginning of this chat, if I'm a country that feels that the United States could just come and kill my leadership, I say, let's get nuclear weapons. If I'm an ally of the United States and the United States behaves so unpredictably, I say, let's decouple from them. So this is destabilizing for the international environment. And that's compatible with it turning out to be less bad than most people expect for Iran. My personal sense of how this is going to go in Iran is pessimistic rather than optimistic. But there's a parameter of possibilities there. I invite you to attend to what country experts have to say. I invite you to be cautious and pessimistic, but of course it can go better than a lot of people think. Even though pessimism is broadly warranted. Also, don't forget this. Trump's a guy who is going to completely miss the degree to which leaders of different countries think differently to him. I'm sure he misunderstood the Iranian leadership in this way. I'm sure he is still misunderstanding what is left of the Iranian leadership in this way. And for goodness sake, he misunderstands his best pal, Putin, in this way. Because Trump has no idea why Putin is conducting the war in Ukraine. He thinks it's something about territory, whereas it's a regime security war that is also aimed at destabilizing Western alliances and Western democracies. Trump psychologically can't grasp this, in good part because his narcissistic personality disorder makes him conceive of his relationship with Putin in personal terms. And so he thinks that in the final analysis, all of these aspirations and strategies are amenable to the vivacity of the personal bond. I'm going to call Vlad again. I'm going to have a great conversation. Hopefully it'll move. No, Vlad has got a theory of success there that he is systematically following. Vladimir, that's what Vladimir is doing. And Trump thinks they're going to have a convivial conversation and shift. You can't shift because Putin is using Ukraine as a lever to destabilize the West, and he wants political control over Ukraine. He's not interested in Ukrainian territory. If you gave him political control over Ukraine, he'd withdraw from all of Donbass tomorrow. But Trump needs to take advice. He needs to study. He needs to reflect on history. He needs to think about the ultimatum, which the Russians released before the full scale invasion in 2022. He's not going to do any of that work. So his best pal, Vladimir, um, even with him, Trump can't grasp how he is motivated. He thinks he's much more motivated by maybe business interests, by territorial acquisition issues, whereas in fact, Putin is much more mystically motivated than Trump allows and is engaged in a regime security war that he sees as essential and defensive. Trump is underestimating how existential this is for Putin in Putin's view. So, and they talk all the time. And if Trump can't grasp what Putin thinks, he's going to have no clue what the Iranians think or what the Chinese think. I'm number 4000 is asking a health question. Have you investigated mold as a potential cause of ME? Mold is not a cause of ME in most cases, but in some cases it is. And so everybody who's ever had ME, of course, spends a good time thinking about mold as a component cause. You're going through your own struggle, and it appears that in many cases, aspergillus mold spores damaged we're not going to change the subject to this damage this person's intestinal lining. What mold exposure often does is it can trigger to escalate a genetic propensity to connective tissue disease, right? So yeah. So mold is likely not a central driver in my case, even though I do have an issue with aspergillus niger and mold, but it's not central. Enough health talk for now. Go to the Vladimir Diary channel. I'm hoping to do more content there soon, and we'll talk health stuff. Right. Is the Russian army capable of taking over, or will it be a criminal group? I don't know what it is that's being taken over. Jimbo is asking me a question in Rusky language for some reason. Do you monitor Russian resources, or do you do this through the prism of uh, the Western information environment? Obviously, I follow whatever there is to follow in Russian and in the original Russian as much as possible. And because of that, I also have a limited capacity to follow things in Ukrainian as well. So, yes, that's absolutely vital. Without that, I couldn't give the kind of analyses I give of Putin. Right. If I just read Putin's speech in English translation, I wouldn't be able to give you anything like the kind of picture I give you. But I'm not very connected um, with any of these Russian folks. I don't talk to them. I don't talk to the Russian opposition. I don't talk to any Russian oppositional broadcasters in exile. Um, I'm aware of them. Um, I think I'm in a WhatsApp group with a few people like Max Katz, but I've never actually said anything in that group. So not for any special reason other than that I'm basically addressing a Western audience. But I think that it would be impossible to give the kind of commentary without the language background. But more importantly, also the cultural background, right? That you can grasp what is going on. Having left the Soviet Union and never indeed lived in Russia, I nevertheless, of course, used to visit Russia frequently as long as my health allowed. And so I have a sense, a somewhat interior sense. Adam is asking, is Trump in some way we can't see in touch with some internal forces in Iran? We don't know. but I would be skeptical about the degree to which the Trump administration has plans and knows what it's doing. There seems to be this idea among Israelis that the Iranian dissidents support Israel. Roth is saying, way around to become democratic. How disappointed would Israelis be by the reality of such an event? Yeah, I mean, if the Iranian uh, um, state somehow became democratic, which is a very far-fetched reality, um, and Iranians could speak up, they'd have an extremely negative view of, for instance, what happened in Gaza. So it doesn't mean that they're going to be friendly to Israel. But it also, don't forget, a democratic Iran would not want to be aggressive to neighbors in the region. Um, we've got two democracies being very aggressive right now, the United States and Israel. Israel is not a democracy outside the 1967 green line. Beyond that, it is a regime of military occupation, colonial rule. But within the green line, it is a democracy. The United States is certainly a democracy, so democracies can engage in violent conduct. However, tendentiously, long-staying authoritarian regimes with leaders with a lot of unchecked power, a great degree of isolation, tend to behave more badly. If Russian democracy hadn't collapsed in the 1990s, Russia would not be engaged in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia may be engaged in other imperial activities that are unlovely, but they wouldn't go that far. So there are certain levels of craziness that are much more plausible when you have an out-of-touch leader atop an authoritarian system. Trump's looking for a quick and easy withdrawal and was only helping Netanyahu. EHA is saying, or LHA is saying, one of the important questions here for US citizens is to ask, even though it's clear that Trump's sense of reality about this is fragmented and limited, whatever information he has, where does it come from? He's not very good to at listening to official briefings. And so a question arises, how far is some of Trump's perspective on this come directly from his chats with Netanyahu? And how far is Trump's thinking of this independent from what Netanyahu has told him? In other words, I'm not wanting to say that there is a clear answer to this, but there is a legitimate democratic question to this. Is this US foreign policy at all? Is this the US deliberatively developing an independent policy or just impulsively following Israel? And if that's a legitimate question, there's a question that's very legitimate at a further remove, which is if European leaders are coming up publicly and privately with mixed up Orwellian statements about how Iran shouldn't attack anybody in the region, which omit the fact that Israel and the United States have attacked Iran, aren't the Europeans outsourcing their position to the Americans, how outsourcing their position to Israel? And so this is important because even if it is even limitedly true, then what a sign of decline and decay and democratic disintegration this is if the regime security needs of an authoritarian populist misbehaving baddie like Netanyahu are in fact the driver of US policy and European policy, insofar as the Europeans are sort of outsourcing this to the United States and saying, well, the United States have got to do what they've got to do. We're not participating, but we're not really saying where we stand on this. We're just sort of giving them rhetorical cover. So these are legitimate questions, and journalists need to ask these questions. I don't know what the answers are. But you wouldn't be surprised because Trump does not idealize Netanyahu anywhere near as much as he idealizes Putin, but he still idealizes Netanyahu. He's better at robustly staying critical of things Netanyahu might do than is the case with Putin, but he still looks up to him. He still loves indulging in the dynamic that they share. And so it is a good question. How much has Trump been influenced by frames and images that Netanyahu put in his head? Let's run through the 2 hours, beautiful community. So 5 more minutes. Does Trump derive narcissistic pleasure in a sadistic form? Farmer's daughter is asking. That is covered. Sorry to be boring, because I bet you've seen it already, but that is covered, I hope, a bit in my video about Trump's narcissism. That's the thumbnail which says Trump's unwell. You can't miss that video. It's Trump with a sort of a zoomed out, a sort of fuzzy Russian flag near him. Do US neocons have a plan for Iran's future besides destabilization? I'm afraid not. And even if somebody like Rubio had more of an idea of the necessity for a plan, you couldn't impose that on the process of the decision making, right? As it happens in the Trump administration, the informality of it. Trump suddenly says something impulsively. He wants to do something, and Witkoff told him something, and then he spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu, and he said something to him, and then Vladimir said something. That's closer to the reality, I'm afraid. It's a cacophony of unseriousness. Rachel is saying, compare Trump's fascination with Putin with his fascination with Mamdani. Mamdani understands that Trump needs to be fed narcissistically. So you give a picture for Trump to hold up, which says Trump's building housing in New York, tremendously big housing, bigger than anybody else. Trump likes it, right? That works. Trump also has such a focus on New York. I mean, New York is a truly great city. But it's the center of Trump's world in many ways. So Trump's open to being enamored with anybody who runs it. And once Trump can get on a certain kind of wavelength, he's able to disregard times Mamdani may have called him a fascist. As long as there are concrete moments of elevation of Trump for the benefit of the media in his dynamic with Mamdani. Mamdani's popularity is a big factor here. He deflates for Trump if he becomes unpopular. He inflates for Trump if he is popular. So there's quite a bit more to say. I think it's probably worth doing a separate video on it. But obviously, Mamdani is not in any way an ego ideal for Trump the way Putin is. Mamdani is just a really good source of narcissistic supply. Because he can give Trump credit for stuff, because Trump can bathe in the glow not of Mamdani the man, but Mamdani's projects or his popularity, his New Yorkness. So all of that Trump likes, but the difference is that he admits what Putin is into the special fantasy society of his creation, whereas he admits just what Mamdani does into that society. That's the difference. He's not inviting Mamdani into this magical order in the way he invites Putin and to a degree Netanyahu. It's more piecemeal. It's Mamdani's position in a certain way, good. I'm going to draw supply from that. Mamdani is going to credit me for something, good. He's done something good. If I bathe in the glow of that, then that's also in my interest. So, in the interest of my narcissistic supply. So it's more about what Putin is with Putin, and it's more about what Mamdani does and says with Mamdani. And he just like, I mean, he likes people who are popular and who are winning. Okay. Let's begin winding down. Happy to see my mug. My mug is pretty ugly. It is actually Soviet. It's about 40 years old. I have very few Soviet things. Lucas is asking me if I think this is good for the Iranian people. We discussed this at the beginning, and I distinguished between whether this is good for the world or good for the Iranian people. These two are not the same. And whether it's good for the Iranian people, I'm skeptical about that, but there's a range of scenarios that could lead to different circumstances, from regime collapse to partial regime fragmentation, partial regime fragmentation, and a more conciliatory stance by the regime, partial regime fragmentation, and a more extremist stance by the regime, civil war, God knows what. So there's a range of scenarios, and we look to country experts who currently simply don't know what's going to happen next to guide us. Okay, you have done very well. Thank you for being with me. We're going to be together soon, beautiful community. We sort of ended up talking a lot about other things that were not Iran, but it just shows the way everything is connected in this extraordinary historical period in which the global arrangements that we have are melting down. And what's so challenging is that they are not being replaced by new arrangements, A, and B, we can't even have a meaningful conversation, seemingly, that allows us to conceive of a future. And so one of the reasons this is so overwhelming for a lot of us is the futurelessness of this, right? We can't envisage something that makes sense, that's going to consolidate and take shape, following on from the things that are melting down, both on the international stage and domestically. We'll keep talking about Iran and Trump specifically. Lots of love, beautiful community, and talk very soon. Bye for now, and happy Sunday.